Well, hello and welcome to Crop Hour. My name's Patrick Wagner. I'm the entomology field specialist based in Rapid City. We've reached the third and final day of insect IPM week. So we're going to continue our discussion focusing on corn and small grains today. Um, just a few things. If you have any questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A, or you can use the chat box as well. Um, if you need those CCA credits, we do have a QR code that will display at the end of today's talk. So with that, I'll bring on Dr. Adam Varenhorst. He's an assistant professor, and he's our state entomology specialist based in Brookings. And he's going to, I think, looks like start off on corn insects, and then we'll move into small grain later on. So, Adam, I can see your slides. It looks good.
All right.
So, you can take it away. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, Pat. All right. Well, we won't do too much of an introduction. We're going to get started today right away with major corn insect pests. And in South Dakota, probably the top two as of right now are the northern corn rootworm and the western corn rootworm. Now, the northern corn rootworm, if you're not familiar, are the green beetles that you typically would see sometime in the middle to late July showing up in cornfields. These adults are emerging from the field, and so that's why we typically start seeing them on the plants. They show up sometime around tasseling, so a lot of times we'll see them climbing around on the tassels, the silks, the leaves, somewhere on the plant. You'll notice that there's some variation in the color. And so if we look here, these somewhat yellow beetles compared to the green ones actually are, the yellow ones are beetles that recently emerged, and so they haven't had a full feed yet. And once they do, you can kind of see this is our transition. They start to take on a green color, and eventually they turn green. Now, they are a little bit smaller than the Western, but not too much. A little bit hard to discern that always, but side by side, they are a little bit smaller. Now, the adults rarely cause economic injury, and that's true for both species of the corn rootworm. The larvae are the big concern because they're feeding on the corn roots. As you can imagine, if we have the roots being fed on, we have serious injury occurring. Well, then we're not going to get as much water as well as nutrient uptake into the plant. We're going to have reduced yields. And another complication is that without a root system, those plants are more likely to have lodging occur, especially during a wind event. So this is the western corn rootworm. The adults are, as I mentioned, are a little bit larger than their northern corn rootworm companions. But another big thing is they're different colors. So they will be yellow in color, and we'd say that they typically have some degree of black markings on their backs. And as you can see in this picture, that marking can vary a little bit. So sometimes it's three distinct lines, and then it's as we go across left to right, sometimes it blurs a little bit. And then eventually we can get to adults that have a black patch, but you can still see the yellow, but essentially those lines have disappeared. And we typically don't even see the larvae for the corn rootworms. But if we go out sometime before emergence in early July, we can sometimes find those late instar larvae, the ones that are nice and large. And this is a picture from a few years ago. We were out in the field. We happened to pull up a plant. It pulled up without a shovel, and we said, oh, this probably has a problem. When we looked at the root system, you could actually see the corn rootworm larvae just kind of having their heyday in those roots. So a lot of pressure on this particular field. So the life cycle for both species is pretty much going to overlap. Obviously, there will be a few differences, but without pinpointing exact days, everything should be pretty close together. And so if we look at where we are right now, we're in the lump of months over here on the far right. We have eggs in the soil. Now, we did have a lot of cold temperatures really recently and today again. And so one of the concerns for us, and it's not so much a concern, but maybe a good thing, is that we don't have a lot of snow cover, which we need the moisture, I know, but without snow cover, those rootworm eggs do not have that layer of insulation in the soil that they normally would this time of year when we get really cold temperatures. And so we will be putting out some extension material here still in the spring before planting to see if we got cold enough to really see any rootworm egg mortality. Because if it gets cold enough, we can actually cause those eggs to freeze. And they're going to be down in the soil quite a few inches. But if we try to figure out, there's been some models in the past that you can use, you just input your temperature data. And so we're going to try to do that and see where we end up. But we're going to have eggs in the soil through the spring up until sometime in early June. And obviously, seasonal differences can affect this, but the larvae will hatch. And if you think about it, it also, I don't have a little picture of a corn plant here, but it matches up when we have emergence of our corn seedlings. And so the larvae will begin feeding on the root systems. The larvae will feed for, depending on the season, sometime between 1 to 2 months, sometimes a little bit longer. At some point, depending on if they get enough food and if it's warm enough, they will pupate in the soil. And then shortly after that, we will get the adult emergence. And obviously, you can see in this graph, there's a little bit of overlap. And that's accounting for some of that seasonal variability that we might see. One of the things with the adults is that we know they are active typically until the first hard frost. And during that time, once they've laid their eggs, more or less, they're just active and searching out some food. But just something to consider that rootworms are active for quite a while. They don't have a quick turnaround on their population. So how do we scout for rootworm injury? Well, there's two methods that we typically talk about. The first is where we actually go out and dig roots up. And we're looking for that larval injury. We recommend digging the corn roots sometime between mid-July and early August because that's when we know that those larvae have fed. We typically trigger it for our research when we first start seeing adults emerging. That's our indicator that the larvae are done. We're going to see what the damage injury to those roots actually looks like. So how do we do that? Well, you go out with as many people as you can round up, if depending on how many fields you have, but either by yourself or with some individuals that work for you and dig up the roots. We typically like to cut the stalks off just because we're bringing back hundreds of root balls, but what this applies to everybody, you have to bring the roots back and we typically soak them for a few hours. Once we soak them, we try to knock a little bit of the dirt off as much as we can in the tank so that we can have an easier time. And we actually use low pressure washes, about the lowest pressure you can find. And as you can see in this picture, we actually pressure wash the roots off. And that's just to clean them because we're trying to see if we have that root injury. And then the next step is to actually examine the roots. And so we're looking at nodes 4, 5, and 6. So this is always something that is kind of backwards. But if you think about the root system, we're actually starting up on the closest to the soil surface where we have the brace roots is node 7. And then the next node down 6, 5, and 4. And so the node 6 is right below the brace roots. And you're looking at how much of those roots have been pruned back. And so this is a relatively healthy plant. You can see there's still a little bit of the scarring. That's that brown color that you see on some of the root systems, but relatively healthy. A lot of root hairs present, and this is a plant that's been fed on heavily. So not as many root hairs, and you can see that there are full nodes missing when we start from the area closest to the soil surface and work towards the lower end. So that we're not done yet. So once you get your ratings, we have to figure out where that falls on a node injury scale that was developed at Iowa State. And it goes from 0 to 3. So if you have a rating of 0 for a field, there's no apparent feeding. And you would not expect to have yield loss due to corn rootworm. Once you hit a rating of 1 on the node injury scale, you're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 15% yield loss. And this is when you have at least one full node destroyed to within 1.5 inches of the stalk. And you can look at these and see a difference. So there's some obvious indications that there was feeding occurring. There's discoloration due to scarring. Node 2, we do the math, falls in between nodes 1 and 3, and it won't fit on my slide. So we're going to jump to the rating of 3. And this is the worst case scenario for a field. A rating of 3 means that you have 2 or more nodes gone when you were evaluating. And a rating of 3 relates to somewhere in the ballpark of a 45% yield loss. And I tell people typically when we get to a rating of 3, you know, before you even start rating, because when you go to hold on to the plant while you dig it up, there's a good chance that the plant's just going to pull up without any resistance. Because if we look at the picture here, there just isn't any root material really left. And so these are the plants that we most often see lodge, and this is what we want to avoid. Now, this is the second method for scouting, and I didn't get this updated. I wanted to show what these cards used to cost a few years ago. Everything's gone up, as we know, but the second scouting method is using these yellow sticky cards. And you put these out, it's kind of the same time period you would if you were going to dig roots in July and August. Each week you put a new set of cards out in your field. We typically recommend putting the cards out kind of in a square shape, so you kind of hit the corners of your field, not be right on the edge, but walk in a ways out of the end rows, just to see what's going on inside the field, but kind of also spread out. You place the sticky cards, and they used to cost $1.59 a piece. They are now over $3 a piece, so not quite as an inexpensive tool as it used to be, considering that you may be putting out a few hundred of these in a season, but it's still a lot more in terms of time. It's a lot shorter time duration each week for the amount of work. So you replace the cards weekly. Each time you replace a card, you look at the one you're taking out and you count the number of corn rootworm adults. And you notice we don't say count each species. It's the total number of northern and western corn rootworm adults that are present on each card. You reach threshold for a field anytime you get an average of 2 adults per card for the field. And what's that mean? Well, it means we have a rootworm pressure issue. And the whole point of all this scouting that we're recommending is to avoid issues like these shown in the pictures. And the big issue with corn rootworms is we have no rescue treatments. So once that corn seed is in the ground, we're crossing our fingers we don't have a rootworm issue. If we scout, we can have a better idea. We don't have to do quite as much crossing of our fingers. We have an idea of what's going on in that field. And so not only can we have lodging issues, but as I mentioned, the reduction in root material causes us to have reduced nutrient water flow. We also have poor ear development. And I also said, well, we don't really worry about the adults, but there are cases where when we have very large populations of the adults in the field, sometimes we need to manage them, especially if they're feeding on the silks. And so foliar insecticides work well for this. It has historically been called beetle bombing if you go out and spray the adults to knock the populations down. But what about thresholds for silk clipping? So in some cases, I know people trigger a spray based on just having very large numbers of rootworms in the field. But if we're looking at a threshold for silk clipping, big thing is you need to have 5 or more beetles per ear. Silks have to be clipped within a 1/2 inch of the tip of the husk, because then we're going to have a harder time for that pollen to drop onto the silks and cause ear fill to occur. And the big thing is pollination needs to be less than 50% complete. And so if you meet these criteria in a season, then it's time to pull the trigger on that foliar insecticide and trying to get a plane lined up or some aerial application, because at that time of the year, it's a little hard to get a ground rig through the field. Now, this is information from 2023, but I think it really drives home a point. So the longer we have corn on corn occurring within a field, you can kind of see a trend here. Our location near Bruce, South Dakota has not been corn on corn for a very long time. It's been in for a few years. And we look and we see that our northern corn rootworms are about half of what our western corn rootworms were. When we look at our other sites, these have been corn on corn for upwards of 15 to 20 years. And what we look at is we see that the western corn rootworm populations are much greater than the northern corn rootworm populations. And that's kind of a trend that we see with our research fields. The longer something's been established, the more western corn rootworm we will see in the field. But northern corn rootworm are still an issue in South Dakota, and we still have to make sure we don't get caught off guard by them. So what are the management options for rootworm? Well, here's a list of the Bt toxins that are currently available for corn rootworm management. And I'm not going to leave that up real long because here's the next slide. Here are things to avoid when trying to manage corn rootworms. We want to avoid single gene traits. We want to try to avoid pyramids containing the Cry3BB1, Cry3435AB1, or eCry 3.1AB. There have been documented cases of resistance towards these in our neighboring states. And although not detected necessarily in South Dakota, part of that's because there haven't been widespread studies to really evaluate that in South Dakota. We've done a few here and there, but we haven't had as many research efforts on this as other states have. So another thing we want to avoid is using BT hybrids plus soil applied insecticides. We don't want to put these two together. And the reason for that is if we're putting selection pressure on the BT genes, we want to leave the soil applied insecticides out of the picture, because if we have a BT failure, we want to make sure that these still work. And so here's what's commercially available. And I'll show you a resource that you can go and look at all this information. Chances are you've already purchased your seed for 2025, but this is some stuff that maybe will help you for 2026. And so we have a lot of options out there. And so if we follow our recommendations for what to avoid, unfortunately, we'd probably avoid all of our options. And so one of the things we have to look forward to, though, in South Dakota is that, as I mentioned, we don't have documented issues against these. But it's something to keep in mind if you do have a failure. Make sure you switch away from the protein that you're currently using or the pyramid that you're using and switch to something else. Other options, crop rotations. That's a big one for Western corn rootworm. If we can break up the rotation, so instead of being corn on corn, switch, that will eventually reduce that pressure. The mild to moderate pressure, the BT should still work. So what's that mean? Well, if we have mild to medium-sized populations out in the field, the BT should still work, but it's when we get those really large populations of corn rootworms, that's when we start to see issues with the BT hybrids. And if you do have really high pressure, we recommend trying an in-furrow insecticide because we test these in the field every year, and we do see pretty reliable knockdown and root protection provided by them. And I mentioned the resource. Well, here it is. It's called the Handy BT Trait Table. So if you have a pen, jot this down. And if you get some time, go and take a look at it. And so this is put together by a researcher from Michigan State, and it's hosted by Texas A&M. And the whole point of this table is every year Chris DeFonso goes through and she finds all of the most up-to-date information for the BT hybrids, what's available for traits, what hybrids are available. And she even puts together a nice table that goes through and highlights what insects are being managed with each of those hybrids. And so a very good tool for when you're trying to decide what seed to purchase going into the next season. And right here's the website. If you wanted to jot that down, it's a little bit long. I could not find a shorter version of it. I apologize, but I'll leave this up for just a couple more seconds. And if you need me to put it back up at the very end, we can do that. So I'd like to just acknowledge the funding sources that helped with all that effort. Was the USDA EIP grant helped us with those extension and applied extension projects. And so now we're going to switch to some insect pests that we haven't necessarily had a lot of issues with, but they're starting to cause a little bit more of a stir in the most recent years. And so one of them is the European corn borer. And we haven't really had a major issue with European corn borers. We've had a few pop-ups here and there in conventional planted corn in recent years, but this kind of disappeared with the adoption of BT hybrids that are effective against it. And so the European corn borer caterpillars are this little insect right here. They're brown, light tan body, dark brown head, have these spots. We typically don't see them though, because they're going to be down in the stalk. And the moths aren't too much to look at either in terms of they're just small brown moths. And the females are a little bit lighter tan color. But the whole point of this is we used to do a lot of monitoring as entomologists for these insects right here, the moths. And now we don't do that as much because the populations aren't as much of a concern. And so what did the European corn borer do? Well, the caterpillars hatch on the leaves and they'll start feeding. When they first start feeding, we get what we call window pane injury. And then they continue to move up the plant. So the eggs are laid on the leaves. They move up the plant to the whorl. When they feed on the whorl, we see the evidence of that because we'll get shot hole injury. So they fed once on this when it was curled up. When the leaf expands, we get this nice row of holes. And then eventually, once they're in the whorl, they just start feeding their way down and into the stalk, and eventually they can cause stalk weakness and also cause some yield losses. So how do we scout for these? Well, there's again a couple different things we can do. One is to use degree day accumulations. We wait until we either capture the first spring moth, or we can use a fixed date of January 1. We accumulate the degree days, and then we figure out how many degree days we have there. And so one of the big things here, I'm going to get down to here, is that we're looking for the accumulated degree days because that tells us when we are going to start seeing those caterpillars active. And you're thinking, why does that matter? Well, we're trying to target the first and second instar of the caterpillar with insecticide sprays, because by the time we get to the middle to late second instar or into any of the other ones, they're already past the point we can get insecticides to them. And so as soon as we know that we have first instar larva active, we see the feeding on the leaves, it's time to try to spray if a large population is present, especially in conventional corn. And so in South Dakota, we can have up to 2 generations. It depends on where you are in the state. And so the first generation we can do a little bit more with. The second one, again, we can try to spray to reduce the chance of it getting into the plant, but eventually these all will get into the plant. Where we do have the 2 generations tends to be in the counties to the further south. You can kind of draw a line across South Dakota. As we get into our northern counties, we have 1 generation. Another way to scout for European corn borers, besides using the degree days, you need to confirm that things are out in the field, is to examine plants. And so we recommend looking at 5 sets of 20 plants or 100 plants total per field per sampling date, which is a lot of work. And you need to look at the whorl to see what percentage of feeding is occurring. If you have plants that have evidence of whorl feeding, then you need to dissect them and record the total larvae present. And then you count the larvae by life stage, see how late they are to see how much damage is going to be occurring. And so again, once they're down in the plant, we can't actually get anything done. But before that, we can have some effect on the little caterpillars. So for management for European corn borer, some these are older recommendations. The best thing to do right now in South Dakota is to plant BT hybrids that are effective against the European corn borer. But historically, the recommendation was don't be the first or last to plant the corn in your neighborhood because you're going to be a bigger target for those moths. Early season, if you're the first, you're going to get targeted by that first population. And if you're last, you're going to get targeted. If you're in the part of the state with 2 generations, you're going to get targeted by that. If you have an infested field, you need to harvest it as early as possible so you don't have extensive lodging occur. And another thing, and this is interesting because growing up, I know we did a lot of different things, but one of the recommendations that I found from the past is don't till in the fall. Idea is that if you leave the stalks above the soil and we get cold, those European corn borer caterpillars are hanging out in the stem and they might freeze to death. Another thing I know happened a lot in the past is removing all of the corn material, the stalks, out of the field using a chopper and then baling it up and getting it out of the field. And so we don't do that quite as much anymore, though, because of all the requirements for residue. But there are still some of those management options out there if we ever have an issue where the BT hybrids stop working. Now, for foliar insecticides, the big thing is you have to treat the majority of larvae either when they're on the leaf still or as they go into the whorl in the field. And the insecticide classes that are recommended, as you can see, there are organophosphates, pyrethroids. And then I list here some BT hybrids. Cry1F is our probably the most widely, and then Cry1AB, and then we have our other combination. But the reason I threw those up there is that they're starting to be, it started up in Canada. As far as I'm aware, the most recent information is that there was an instance of this in Connecticut as well, where we're seeing the BT resistant European corn borer showing up. And so it's starting on the East Coast, but there is always the possibility that it could move across the country. And this would be quite a detrimental effect if it gets to the South Dakota and the rest of the Midwest and Northern Great Plains. So something that researchers will continue to monitor, but we aren't seeing any issues in South Dakota at this time. Another insect we talk about a lot in the spring are the common stalk borers. And we put out information to when these will be active based on degree days. And the big thing here is that these aren't going to affect the entire field, but they can really make the edges of the field look pretty rough. And so it's something we try to bring up every year. And the caterpillars themselves are kind of a unique color. We say they kind of have a purple saddle right here on their body. They have an orange head. They're fairly small, and then they have this black stripe. Common stalk borers are going to feed on the leaves and kind of leave a ragged appearance like you see there. They'll leave what we refer to sometimes as sawdust. This is their excrement as they move into the plant. And then eventually they'll make it into the whorl where they'll feed. And as I mentioned, they're most common around the edges of the field. Younger corn is going to be more susceptible, which responds to when they actually are moving into the field. And so what we recommend is once we hit the degree days for this pest is scout 30 random plants in your border rows from May to June and see whether or not you have any evidence. If you have evidence, look into the whorl, and eventually there's a good chance you'll find the caterpillar. And so the economic threshold for these is based off the stage that the corn is at, and then also what the current value of corn is. Obviously, this needs to be updated a little bit. When I made this slide, things were a little bit different, but you can imagine these numbers now are lower. And so we probably don't always hit the threshold for these, but depends on if you want the edges of your field to look nice. So one of the recommendations we have is don't remove fields around the borders of the field prior to emergence. If you spray out your weeds before the corn emerges or immediately after corn emergence, you're going to increase the chances of getting common stalk borer because they use the weeds that are around the fields as alternative hosts. Once we kill that weed, they're going to abandon ship and look for the next host, which a lot of times is a field of corn. Foliar insecticides really should be applied during larval movement from those alternative hosts into the field. I know that's always a real easy thing to do, but using those degree days and scouting can really improve the chances of catching that. The other thing is we typically only need to hit the first 4 to 6 first part of your end rows around the field edges because that's about as far as they'll move in typically. They don't move in extremely far into the field. Another insect that we have pop up about every year to some extent is black cutworm. The caterpillars themselves get the name because they're dark in color. They kind of look rough. And the big thing with these is that they cut plants. That's where they get their name cutworm. So they don't start out in South Dakota. They migrate from the southern US every year. Female moths are attracted to wet and weedy fields. So what we recommend is start scouting at emergence, continue through V4, look at 20 plants throughout a field. And what you're looking for is if you have cut seedlings or evidence that a plant was fed on, because sometimes they'll feed on the leaves first and then eventually they'll cut. But if you start seeing cut plants like this, it's your indicator that you have black cutworm out in the field. And Cry1F can be a management option for this, but foliar insecticides for fields that are hit really hard are typically what are selected. They need to be applied later in the day, just for the fact that black cutworms are going to be they're nocturnal, so they're more active later in the day and in the evening. So that's all I have for corn insect pests. So we'll save our questions till the end here. But now we're going to switch into wheat insect pests. And first thing we're going to cover are Hessian flies. And this is an insect that showed up to some extent a year ago. Uh, well, if we look at calendar years now, too, it caused some issues in central South Dakota. And so the flies themselves are very small. The larvae are also very small, and we say they're semi-translucent. They're kind of hard to find. We typically come across the pupa, and we say that they're flax-like pupa, as shown here. And so this is a stage that in my career I've seen the most reported, because by the time we have these, we already are starting to see issues in the field. They're going to be towards the base of the plant. So there's 2 generations per year. The adults will emerge in April to May from winter wheat or alternative hosts that were infested the previous fall. Larvae will feed for 30 days. Once they hatch, they move to the crown and pupate. The second generation of adults will emerge in August to September, and that starts the life cycle over again. And the larva will overwinter, and then we get the feeding in the next spring. And so some impacts are stunted growth. The foliage can be a little bit blue-green or darker than normal. The big thing that we were seeing was lodging. A lot of lodging was occurring, and this occurs if the infestation happens during stem elongation. And the average yield loss is somewhere in 5 to 10% range, but the lodging obviously can make things a lot worse. And so this is one of the fields that was reported, and so very serious lodging in this field. But how do we manage this pest? Well, the big thing is to prevent the green bridge. We can't have alternative hosts available, especially in the fall when we're planting the winter wheat. So we're trying to reduce what's available for them for hosts. Another thing is to delay planting. And we don't have exact dates. These are based on looking at neighboring states and also the historical fly-free dates. The issue with those historical fly-free dates, sorry, that's a mouthful, is that they might not be extremely accurate anymore. It's been somewhere in the ballpark of almost 100 years now since those were put together, and so they might not be as accurate as they used to be. And so for South Dakota, we're saying sometime around September 20th for the northern half of South Dakota for a fly-free date. And for the southern half of South Dakota would be October 15th. Now, I know that's going to not be very popular, because I know a lot of people want to get their winter wheat planted while there's still some moisture and some warmth. But for the Hessian fly that's looking at our neighbors to the north and around, this is what we came up with for what our fly-free dates probably are. And so we do have some options for resistant cultivars, but if you see here for South Dakota are to be identified, so those are ongoing breeding efforts. And another thing is crop rotation to avoid them. Another big pest that we have in wheat, well, we thought was wheat stem sawfly. We do have this in South Dakota. For a couple years, we were getting a ton of reports of wheat stem sawfly. The adults resemble wasps, as you can see here. They have a body shape and coloration is very similar to a wasp. Difference is these won't sting. The larvae are cream colored. They're always going to be found inside the stems, and when you split a stem apart, typically they have an S shape because of how they have to be in the stem to move. Now, the wheat stem sawflies will begin emerging in May when temperatures get above 62 degrees. They'll continue emerging for 3 to 4 weeks after that. The adults don't live for an extremely long period of time. They live for about 7 days. They don't feed on the wheat. And so we don't worry about the adults a ton in terms of management, except for their laying eggs. And so you only have 1 larva per plant because they are cannibalistic, and the larvae will feed until the plants begin to dry down in the right before harvest. So what do these really do? Well, they cause lodging as well. And so some of the reports that we are getting were lodged wheat, and that was being attributed to wheat stem sawfly. These things by themselves in our hollow stem varieties can cause 2 to 10% yield loss, and they can cause up to 50% loss due to severe lodging. And so we want to avoid that. The catch with these is that we do have solid stem varieties that reduce their ability to infest the wheat plant. They prefer the hollow stem varieties. The catch there, though, is that the solid stem varieties have a bit of a yield drag compared to the hollow stem varieties. And so we only want to use those varieties where we know we have wheat stem sawfly pressure. If we look at the historical data for South Dakota, where reports were done for where wheat stem sawfly showed up, we see that it was in the northern line of counties, so pretty much from east to west. But a note was made that it was especially our far northwestern counties that had more populations. So how do we scout for these? Well, the best approach that we found is just to use a sweep net and go out and scout for adults in the spring. They're not great flyers, so we typically start on the field edge and then move into the field. Field edges will have higher infestations. If we confirm that there's a population, then we go back and check stems for whether or not the larvae were present and figure out how much of an infestation is present in the field. And the big thing here is to harvest the fields earlier to avoid having the lodging occur. But another thing to look for is to how bad the cut plants are right before harvest. And so the big issue with this, like I've talked about for some of our other insect pests that are in the plants, we can't actually get a rescue treatment after infestation occurs. Once these insects, any insect is in the stem, it's almost impossible to get a product to them or do anything to reduce the populations. We have to do it before they get in the plant. And so some research has been done, not in South Dakota, to look at whether or not insecticide applications to reduce the adult activity are effective. The research that's looked into that says that they aren't profitable because these don't all emerge at one time. They have a delayed emergence. And so you'd need at least 3 sprays, and you get somewhere in the ballpark of a 3.3 bushel per acre increase. But you're spending more than that on your insecticide sprays. So not going to be profitable. Solid stem varieties are effective, but again, I said there was a yield cost there. They yield about 10 to 15% less than the hollow stem varieties. And so you really want to make sure you're in an area where you need those to be using them. And you really only want to use those where there's very serious infestations of the wheat stem sawfly. And so we've been conducting a survey for the last 2 years to evaluate where wheat stem sawfly are because we were told that they were everywhere. And so when we look at the 2023 survey results, and we sampled all 66 counties, we sampled somewhere between 2 and 4 fields per county in 2023. And after all of that driving and scouting and the thousands of sweet nut samples that were collected, we only had infestations detected in Harding and Perkins County, which, if you remember, that matches the historical information that it's the far northwestern 2 counties that are going to have the heaviest infestations. And so in I apologize, it's supposed to say 2024 up on top. I have a typo there on my part, but if we look at the 2024 results, we didn't sample all 66 counties this time around. We sampled 25 counties and we focused on the northernmost and then also the southernmost counties. The reason for that is Nebraska has detected wheat stem sawfly literally across the border in fields and grasslands in most of our counties on the southern edge. We also wanted to confirm whether or not there were any more wheat stem sawflies in the northern counties. We tried to expand our sampling dates a little bit in case we missed the emergence the previous year. Maybe we were too early. And what we came up with in 2024 is we only had an infestation detected by having adults in Harding County. So the 2 years of the survey are pretty much telling us that the wheat stem sawfly are more or less kind of located up here in the Northwest, which isn't a surprise for us. And now when we look back, we think that some of those reports we are getting from the rest of the state were possibly actually due to the Hessian fly, because as we talked about, it can cause lodging if the infestation occurs during stem elongation. And so there's the chance that that might be the culprit there. Another thing we're going to talk about are grasshoppers because they can be a major issue for wheat. And It's a little early to talk about this, but they a lot of times are an issue for us during the planting of winter wheat. They can also be an issue though in the spring for spring wheat. But the adults and nymphs both cause defoliation. If we get large populations, we can have a lot of forage loss. And in cases, there are fields that it looks like a mower went through and you have to have some replanting occur. So if we look back at our historical records here for where grasshoppers were the last few years in South Dakota, well, we had some problem areas, and they tend to be in the central part, southeastern part, and western South Dakota. It's just depends on where we get dry. And uh, a couple years ago, we didn't have a lot of issues. This most recent in 2024, we had several reports of issues, especially in wheat. So what really drives these grasshopper populations? Well, one of the things is when we have our first hard frost. If we look here, going backwards, 2020 to 2024, we've had pretty favorable falls where the frost is later than maybe we would expect in several areas of South Dakota. And 2021 to 2024, we've also had areas of the state where there's been drought present. Now, the three species of insects that, or grasshoppers particularly, that we monitor for in South Dakota because we know that these cause a lot of issues for us are the differential grasshopper, the red-legged grasshopper, and the two-striped grasshopper. Now, out of these three, the differential and the two-striped are going to be much larger than the red-legged. They get their names. The differential doesn't really have a lot of things that look different maybe, but they are green, and they're going to have these dark chevrons on their hind leg. Red leg get its name because they have a segment of their leg that's red. And the two-striped, as you can imagine, get their name because they have two stripes. And this is obviously not wheat, but this is a field to just really demonstrate how serious these pests can be. So it's not just wheat we worry about. It's everything for grasshoppers can be at risk. We can have a nice field one week, and the next week it looks like something major happened to it. If we zoom in, it wasn't hail, it was two-striped grasshoppers. And that literally in a week's period, it went from looking very nice to pretty much we had a few heads left and no leaves. And grasshoppers not only will feed on the leaves and cause maybe stand loss for us early season, but they also will feed on the parts of the plant that we harvest. And this is also the case for small grains, especially wheat. And so when they do this, we need to manage them. So what's the prediction for 2025 then for our grasshopper populations? Well, we did have drought conditions last year. We currently are having some drought conditions in the winter, but I typically don't base everything off of that because there's always a chance we're going to get precipitation in the spring. But just looking at the populations we had in the last few years, especially in 2024, my thoughts are that we're probably going to see some areas with large populations in 2025. Depending on the spring conditions, these populations may show up early, which could be an issue for our spring wheat planting, depending on when that can get out in the field. Now, I know ideally that will be occurring before the grasshoppers really get active, but then emergence might be occurring around the same time the grasshoppers are starting to show up. And so here is the most recent drought monitor map. They probably now have the one out for this week because they release them every Thursday. But when I put the talk together last night, this is the most up-to-date one I could find. And so we see that we do have drought still, different degrees of it for as far as intensity across the state, but we do still have drought in South Dakota. And if we look up in the Northwest, where some areas where we had lots of grasshopper reports, they're also currently under extreme drought in some of those areas. So anywhere there's currently extreme drought or even severe drought, those are areas that I think we really need to monitor for grasshoppers starting in the spring and continuing through the summer, unless we get some major precipitation. If we look at another predictor factor for us is this actually is the first frost date from 2023. We see our entire state's green. That means the first frost occurred sometime in October, and it varied from the first week to the third week. we look at 2024's first frost, we see that there are cases where we see that light brown color. That's actually the first hard frost in November. Now, one of the things that might benefit us is up in Hardin County, we did have a large area where the drought is currently present, where they also had an earlier frost. And the same thing as we go south. But we still have some areas that are much later. And with grasshoppers, that just gives them more time to lay eggs and more time to stick around and increase those potential populations for the following year. So how do we scout for grasshoppers? And again, this isn't just for small grains and wheat. This is for all our crops. We use visual counts. We stand in one spot, you stand still, and you estimate a square yard around yourself. And so when you're standing there, then you count how many grasshoppers are moving around in that square yard. When you have 30 to 45 nymphs per square yard, you're at threshold, or 8 to 14 adults. And when they're moving around a lot, it might be a little hard to tell if it's adults or nymphs, but you can kind of base that off of size. Unless you know that you have red-legged grasshoppers, then you're going to want to look a little bit closer. But if you hit those thresholds, then it's time for to do a foliar application of insecticides. One of the big things with grasshoppers is we always recommend trying to treat when they're in the smaller stages. It's just easier to knock those populations down. The more mature they get, when they reach adulthood especially, they're just harder to knock down with insecticides. Another insect we keep an eye on every year, we haven't had major issues for probably the last 2 years, is true armyworm. But the catch is the year we take some time off from this pest, it will show up again and cause major issues. And so we want to stay on top of remembering how to scout for it and what it looks like. So true armyworms get their name because they'll move in large groups and they feed on leaves. Another thing is they can cause major issues if they feed on the flag leaf and destroy it. They'll also clip heads if they're present in the field close to harvest. And so these are reasons that we keep an eye on it, because we don't typically just get a few of these caterpillars. If we get a population, they move up from the southern US too. And so if a large population moves north, all of a sudden we can have large portions of a field essentially disappearing. Because there are cases where in recent years, where they've stripped 20 to 30 acre patches out of wheat fields. And then once the leaves are all gone, they're still hungry. And so eventually they'll start, as you see in these pictures, going up to the seeds. And so we want to avoid that. So easiest way to scout for these visual counts, in my opinion, aren't the easiest. Sweep nuts are. Unless you're getting close to harvest and you don't want to knock all of the plants apart, then visual counts might be a little easier. Threshold is 2 caterpillars per square yard, or approximately 40 caterpillars per 30 swings of a sweep net, or if you have any head clipping occurring. And I have some insecticides listed here. This is in no way an endorsement of these products. I put these on here though because they have the shortest pre-harvest intervals. If you don't remember, pre-harvest intervals are the amount of time you have to wait from application of the insecticide to when you can safely harvest that product. A lot of products will have 20 to 30 day pre-harvest intervals. If you're treating for head clipping prior to harvest, and harvest might be a week or two away, you don't want to wait 30 days. And so these products will not cause you to have to delay harvest due to waiting for that pre-harvest interval to expire. Another insect that's already out in our fields right now in winter wheat is the army cutworm. They actually hatched in the fall. The moths target winter wheat and alfalfa fields when they're moving back into our state from the Rocky Mountains. The caterpillars will feed a little bit in the fall and then they overwinter. The issue with these guys is that they start feeding as soon as it warms up. And so since they're already out in the field, they can cause issues really quick, and we really need to stay on top of scouting for them. If we have a lot of feeding, the result can be stand losses. And so the nice thing with these though, we have other cutworms that will actually destroy the plant if we catch an army cutworm population soon enough. Even if we have some feeding that's already occurred, those plants, as long as it's not extremely dry, a lot of times will rebound and come back. The threshold for the army cutworm is 2 to 4 caterpillars per square foot. If you have large areas of the field that are clipped, and then especially if you have all of that occurring and drought stress is present. Now, since these are getting treated in the spring, one of the things we've run into in the past is the temperature can really cause some headaches for application. We need to have 3 to 4 days post application where the temperatures are warm. And by South Dakota standards, that's 50 degrees or higher in the spring. And the reason for that, these are nocturnal insects. And so if we spray and then it cools off, there is a good chance that they aren't going to be active until it warms back up, and we're going to lose our insecticide efficacy out in the field before these things start moving around again. And so we want to make sure they get exposed. And in order to do that, we need to have some warm weather. And another thing we need to try to do is spray later in the day to promote coverage because they are nocturnal. So we spray in the morning. We're just giving that insecticide chance to break down in the sun during the day, and we just want to make sure we try to get the most insecticide to these to have good effects. And although this isn't an insect that falls into the entomologist court a lot of times is wheat crow mite, the pathologists typically cover this more than we do because of the fact that it spreads wheat streak mosaic virus, and then that's the big issue in the field. But wheat crow mites are very small. They're almost impossible to see without a hand lens. The adults get moved around on the wind. They overwinter on green plant material. So one of the big things with these is trying to make sure there's not a green bridge for them to move around. And pretty much the only management recommendations we have are prevent the green bridge and then delay planting to try to avoid when they're moving around. There are not products out there for managing these. We get that question a lot, and there's been a lot of research done and nothing's really looked effective. And then the last insect we'll talk about are wheat stem maggots. I see the evidence of these out in the fields pretty much every year. Depends on where you're at. There can be cases where the fields have a ton of evidence of infestation, and in some cases they're not as bad. There's also a disease that looks very similar to this. So how do you tell the difference? Well, if it's the disease, if you go pull one of the bleached heads, kind of give it a yank, it won't pull out. If it's wheat stem maggot that caused the issue, if you pull on the head, you'll actually pull that segment right out of the stem. And the reason for that is these little larvae here feed. We can't see it in the picture, but imagine it's about down here where they're feeding inside the stem. When they feed, they cause the stem to no longer have connection, and so the plant stays together, but no nutrients are going up, and eventually the head bleaches out, and it pulls out, and you can actually even see where they fed most of the time when you do this out in the field. So typically not a major pest in South Dakota. They're considered minor because most fields we don't have the entire field be affected. And also, to my knowledge, there hasn't really been any evidence that insecticides are real effective against managing these. So I have a few slides for all of your information. And then here's my contact slide. So if you need to get a hold of me, whether it's in regards to this talk or regarding any issues you run into during the summer, spring, summer, fall, regarding insect populations, please feel free to reach out to me. If you want to, you can come visit me in my office, which is on campus. Probably an easier option, it would be to call my office phone number. Uh, we'll always be answering that, or I also will always be answering my email. I haven't updated this, but I guess Twitter or now X. I do have a Twitter. Catch with that is I really only am on there during the summer, and I most of the time just am looking at if I have insects I want to post to get that information out a little bit earlier than our articles or posting articles. So best ways to contact me, though, would be my office number or my email. And with that, I will stop sharing and I'll turn things back over to Pat and answer any questions if there are any.
So I see that Candy actually put in the a link to the drought monitor, the UNL drought monitor, and they just released the new map today, and it looks like from the one that you showed from last week, it has not changed at all.
Okay.
So it hasn't
Well,
gotten any worse, but it also hasn't gotten any better. So
sure. I see Paul has a question here. So for grasshoppers, would spraying ditches and roadsides when they are small be beneficial? Uh, that's a good question, Paul. And, logically speaking, yes, that would be effective. The catch is we have to make sure the products are labeled for that. And so that's where we start to run into some problems. All products aren't necessarily labeled for out of the field, so those are considered different than the field, and you have to always check the labels to make sure that falls within. So typically what we recommend is scouting. We even use that sometimes in the season to scout first so we know which fields are at the highest risk. But then we wait and cross our hands and wait until they get into the field, and then we do an application. But field edges definitely, so maybe not necessarily the roadside ditch, but field edges can be effective. And in some cases, I know from recent years, if we catch these populations right as they start moving in the field, just treating the borders of the field can be really effective. And I didn't have it up, but another thing for wheat and other small grains that sometimes we recommend is overseeding the first 100 to 200 feet of the field. And the whole reason for that is you can afford then to lose some of the seedlings to the grasshoppers, and you can save the money on the insecticides. But obviously, you can't have a terrible population for that to be effective. That's for your medium populations.
yep. So it looks like we do have another question in the Q&A. This one popped up a little bit earlier during the corn talk. So this one is ideally how many sticky cards per field and best place to put them. And I think
Sure.
for context, this was for your during your
Yep.
corn worm.
Yep.
Yep.
So that's a good question. And so for what we typically do, I recommend trying to do at least four per field. So right now that's somewhere in the ballpark of $12 a week for scouting, which if we were out scouting and you figured out your hourly rate, you're still saving money. I just wish these sticky cards weren't as expensive as they are now. But so four cards for per field. And my recommendation is typically to get inside of the field. So don't put them right in the end rows because you're going to see more population movement in those end rows. You might have individuals coming from neighboring fields. So trying to get into the field a little bit will give you a better idea of what your field is actually producing. And so all fields aren't necessarily a perfect square, but uh, we think about it. I always say try to get into the four corners of the field or close to the four corners. And obviously, if the field is very large, that's not going to be quite as effective, but somehow spread those cards out enough so you're getting a good representation of what your field looks like. And in those really large fields, you probably want to increase your number of sticky cards just so that you're getting a better picture of what the entire field infestation looks like. Because sometimes you'll have patches of these rootworms where one area of the field will be a little bit hotter, and as you move away, uh, maybe you won't have hardly any emerging. The longer though a field's corn on corn, it seems like things kind of balance out, and we just end up with a lot of rootworms across the field. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so I don't see any other questions here in the Q&A or the chat. There is a poll that's activated. It looks like we got pretty good feedback on that one. So thank you everyone for filling that out. Um, yeah, I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. I just want to invite everyone to tune in for next week. We have that's going to be the disease and fungicides week. So we have a couple plant pathologists from SDSU, Madeline Shires and Connie Strunk, that are going to be running that show. So that's what's on tap for next week. But thank you again, Adam, for your presentation. Thank you everyone for attending today, and have a great week.
All right. Thanks, everyone.